I am so thrilled to be here with Victoria Bateman, who I've had the pleasure of researching over the last few days. And yeah, my opinions have changed. I've learned a lot. I've been so well educated. I particularly love a few of your lectures you have online where you have a visual throughout the whole thing. And it's so brilliant. I'm quite hyperactive and I learned so much. I was so engaged throughout it. And I've learned a lot about the history of women within economics. So I'd love if you could introduce yourself in a way which feels best appropriate.
Thank you. Well, it's such a treat to be with you all today. Thank you so much for inviting me. So I'm a writer, an academic, and very much a feminist. So excited to be with you here for International Women's Day.
Brilliant intro, the perfect opener. So I'm going to start with my first question because there's a lot to cover, and your breadth of knowledge, I really want to cover a lot of it. So there's a strong parallel between your views on women's bodily autonomy, as expressed in your book Naked Feminism, and their economic autonomy, as in your new book, and Economica, which is out there if anyone would like to read it. What is it about society that leads to attempts to restrict women's autonomy? And is there a correlation between attempts to restrict the body and the mind?
Such a great question, and this really gets us to the heart of the issue. And where I'd like to begin is taking you back to 2020. Not to the deepest, darkest days of the pandemic that we all remember, but instead to the unveiling of a statue. It's a statue of the early feminist, Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, actually, it's not a figurative depiction of her. It's designed to honor her contribution to society. And when this statue was unveiled, so it would have been November 2020, it caused horror and panic within the feminist community. Feminists took to social media, in the press. They were writing about their disappointment and disgust. And in terms of this statue, what was this statue? So you have this undulating organic metal form, out of which emerges at the very top a tiny naked lady by the brilliant artist Maggie Hamling. I love Maggie Hamling. And as one journalist summed up the reaction in the press, many feminists feared that the bodily display, this naked woman, the body being on display, distracted from the intellectual prowess of Mary Wollstonecraft. And I think this rather negative feminist reaction really reveals something about our society. And that is the way that we so commonly, even as feminists, divide women up into two groups, the bodies and the brains. And if you're a body, you're assumed not to have intellect. You're assumed to be stupid. It's felt that you're not worth listening to. It's felt that you don't have something to contribute through your brain to society. So women that come to be labeled the bodies get written off, not taken seriously. Whereas if you're categorized into the camp of the brains, then you have to be quite guarded about your body, if you want to continue to be taken seriously for what you have to contribute through your brain. And I think, that the way in which that feminist reaction, embodied that division of women into bodies and brains, I think is quite worrying. And as a feminist, I firmly believe that women's mental freedom, the freedom for us to use our brains as we wish is very much rooted, hangs on our bodily freedom, that you can't separate body and brain. You can't have freedom of the brain without freedom of the body. And actually someone who understood that more than anyone was Mary Wollstonecraft herself, who this sculpture is there to honor. So if you dig into her feminist writings, and she's seen very much as a champion of women's education in particular, so women using their brains, she identified the obstacles in the way of women using their brains in the time that she lived. You know, the 18th century. This is the time of bonnets and Bridgerton. And she argued that it is parents' fear of their daughters losing their virginity. You know, parents' fear of their daughters losing their bodily purity, that means that parents were reluctant to send their daughters out to school in the way that they did their sons, to let their daughters travel, to let their daughters engage in, you know, far-ranging paid work. And so for Wollstonecraft, very much the freedom of the mind was rooted in the ability for women to forgo their bodily purity, should they wish. So that idea that for women to have freedom of the mind, they need to also have freedom of the body is really at the heart of my work.
Yeah, and I love that. I'm going to come back to that in a few questions, because, you know, even when I was looking into your work, we're all sort of there saying we're feminists and saying, oh, you know, the hijab is you know, shouldn't be enforced if women don't want to wear it. And then if someone wears a short skirt, you go, oh, but that's a bit short. And it's like, I think the less judgmental we can be and just let people wear what they want to wear. Like you said earlier to me downstairs, you're like, those two people should be able to hold hands. And it is just that lack of judgment which would actually move us forward rather than one rule for all. So my next question, I'm just, you know, going to bring it to what's going on at the moment. With Trump in the White House and right-wing and religiously conservative groups making headway in so many countries, what does this say about the direction societies across the world are moving in? And what is your message to Trump and his ilk?
Okay, I always have a message for Donald Trump.
You never know where things will go.
If they let me in the country, then I would be happy to take this message all the way to the White House. But failing that, I'm going to deliver this message here and now. And this message is going to use the full force of my body and brain. Now, if that offends anyone here, feel free to, you know, dip out into the bar and, you know, get a drink or whatever else. But I am a woman who is not afraid to use my body for something other than, you know, sex and babies and, you know, what women are supposed to use it for. I'm quite happy using it as a method of protest. So here we go. My message for Donald Trump is really very simple, and that is hands off women's bodies. Take back to the microphone. Women cannot be free unless we are free to use our bodies as we wish. And if you truly, Donald Trump, want to make America great, then the best way that you can do that is to support rather than undermine women's bodily freedoms. Because as I show throughout my books, in Naked Feminism, in Economica, the most successful civilisations throughout history have always been those that have moved closer to supporting women's freedoms to do what they want with their bodies and their brains. And subsequent civilizational collapses come as a result of rejecting women's bodily freedoms, of pushing women into the home, restricting what they can do with their bodies and with their minds. But I also have a message to my fellow feminists, and that is that modesty culture, Puritanism, is not the antidote to raunch culture. Now, I understand that a lot of feminists are worried by raunch culture, worried by the sexualization, worried by the objectification of women. But demonizing immodest women, demonizing glamour models, demonizing sex workers, demonizing naked protesters like me is not the answer. Women's bodies are never the problem. What is there to fear from a woman's body? Do my breasts fire bullets? Does my crotch launch, a weapon carrier? No, there's nothing to fear from women's bodies, unless you are the patriarchy. And then there is something to fear, because the patriarchy rejects the idea that women are both bodies and brains, because when we are both bodies and brains, we are at our most powerful. So it will only let us be either bodies or brains, and in the process of doing that, it sets us at war with one another. So please, fellow feminists, Puritanism is on the rise. It is the Trojan horse within the movement. It promises to be our savior. It promises that so long as we cover up a little bit more, so long as we're less promiscuous, then we can achieve the feminist utopia in which men take us seriously. And you know what? I do not want to pass a modesty test in order to be taken seriously, because I do not feel that as a woman, my respect, my value has to hang on the degree to which my body has been seen or touched. Because as women, we are worth so much more than that. So, to those feminist critics of that Wollstonecraft statue, Wollstonecraft was onto something, and she was onto something in the 1700s. And let's take a lesson from her today.
In the last few days, I've been, as I said, familiarizing myself with Victoria's work, and there was an incredible interview which she did on ITV Breakfast. And I was saying downstairs, the most shocking thing for me watching that was that the female presenter had more of an issue than the male presenter. And I do think, for feminism to move forward, like I said, it is just not to judge and just to support different opinions. And like you said, just listen to different female voices. So my next question, after everything you've just said, is that you're clearly willing to use your body as well as your brain to deliver your message. From protesting against Brexit, campaigning for women's freedoms, can you explain what has led you to do this and what reactions you've received?
Okay, so let me now take you back, not to 2020, but instead to 2016. June 2016. What do we remember about June 2016?
Disaster.
Yes. The ultimate own goal. I mean...
I definitely didn't remember
yes,
that.
so Brexit. Now, on the run-up to the referendum, I had written thousands of words, in the press about what a ginormous act of self-harm Brexit would be. So please, up and down the country, please don't vote for Brexit. And economists, I'm an economist by training, and, economists, we disagree over lots of things. But when it came to Brexit, I've never seen such unanimous opinion, amongst economists, that Brexit would be bad for the British economy. We shouldn't touch it with a barge pole. But nevertheless, Britain voted for Brexit. And, the morning after that vote, I was getting ready. I started to put on my clothes, and I thought, do you know what? Brexit has left Britain naked. So I'm not going to put on my clothes. I'm going to head into Cambridge, and I'm going to spend a whole day at the university. It was late June, so it's end of academic year, lots of end of academic year meetings. I'm going to spend a whole day there naked with this metaphorical depiction of what Brexit did to Britain. And, I think I've probably been vindicated, in terms of what's happened since. I mean, Brexit was the start of this movement to turn inwards on ourselves, to reject international cooperation, to, Donald Trump and his rejection of everything that we used to stand for. And, sadly, we got there first as Britain. So I thought I was going to spend this whole day at the university, not just as a metaphor, but in solidarity with my European colleagues. And I had heard and seen from my European colleagues at the university how much on the run-up to the referendum, they and their children were being bombarded with this anti-immigration messaging, the way their children were coming home from school and repeating things that had been said in the playground, things that led to, very upsetting and difficult conversations. And so I wrote across my torso, "Brexit leaves Britain naked." I spent the morning in meetings with my economics colleagues, and then in the Department of Economics, and then I headed across Cambridge, naked, into Fellows' lunch at my college, Gonville and Keys, and then I spent the afternoon in meetings with my colleagues there at Keys, end of term meetings. And, I have used my naked body as a means of protest in other ways as well. So a couple of years later, in 2018, I walked naked into the Royal Economic Society champagne reception with shoes, a handbag, long gloves, and a feather in my hair because, it was a champagne reception after all. And, grabbed my glass of champagne and just chatted happily and normally with my colleagues. And my aim was to be the elephant in the room, to highlight the lack of women in the discipline and how that lack of women in the discipline was feeding through to lead to a lack of acknowledgement of, the importance of women's bodily freedom in terms of tackling things like poverty, in terms of supporting economic growth in the economy. So I've used my body in those types of contexts. I've used it on stage. I did a one-woman show at the Cambridge Junction, The Naked Truth about Brexit. You can find that online. And I think the important thing is never to be ashamed of our bodies. What is there to lose? What is there to fear?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I always say my favorite thing is seeing people reach their potential, and I just think what you're doing is incredible. I feel lucky that we have you here on International Women's Day. So coming back to women's role in economy, what lessons can you draw from your book Economica in terms of the causes of the rise and decline of civilisations?
So history in economic terms is a long and repeated story of rise and decline. It's the story of one civilization after another, amassing great wealth, achieving great things before falling into a ditch ready to be found by some unsuspecting archaeologist centuries or millennia down the line. But you cannot tell that story without women. Because as I show in Economica, and to repeat, and it deserves repeating, every successful civilization of its day, whether that's ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, imperial China, the West in the 20th century, every successful civilization has been one where women are welcomed at the heart of the economy. But their subsequent civilizational collapse has been preceded by a process of eating away at women's rights and freedoms. So did you know that 2,000 years ago in the Roman world, the Romans were in a moral panic about all of the things that we're in a moral panic about today? They worried about falling fertility rates. They worried about women not getting married. They worried about rising immigration. They worried about traditions being lost to growing cosmopolitanism. And the response of the emperors, starting with Augustus, was to fan the flames of this moral panic by blaming Roman women. By scapegoating Roman women, by suggesting that the problem was Roman women were spending too much time setting up businesses, shipping their wine and olive oil across the Mediterranean, when they could instead be in the home, breeding for the Roman world. When the Romans began to push women into the home and out of the workplace, it didn't help the economy. The Roman world went from rise to decline, and I very much worry we're at risk of repeating that again today.
To come to my last question, and I'm excited to hear your answers for this because I listened all through the years of your book and found some favourites of my own, but I would love for the room to hear a few of your favourite women from history, both examples from business and also those who have broken bodily taboos.
So I have hundreds of examples in my book, Economica. Economica is the first economic history of the world from the Stone Age to the present day to be told through the eyes of women. And it's filled with all of the female equivalents of Henry Ford and J.P. Morgan. But I think I'm going to tell you two of my personal favorites. One, Josephine Baker, the wonderful Josephine Baker, the dancer from the first half of the 20th century, who had no shame, who was known for her erotic dances. And sadly, she had a really difficult time within the context of the civil rights movement because some sadly saw her, because of the way that she used her body, some saw her as unrespectable, as undermining the fight for civil rights for the African American community. But I absolutely adore her response to that. And her response was, and bear in mind, her most famous dance was one that involved a banana skirt and jiggling away. And her response to her critics was, the rear end exists, and I see no shame in it, but it is true that there are those who have rear ends that are so boring, so pretentious, so stupid, that they are only good for sitting on. And to give you my second personal favourite, Lady Godiva. And, if anyone wants to bring me a horse to the to the stage door, I'm happy to, head off on a horse and take my message throughout London. If not, I'm afraid whoever's on the train with me this afternoon might have to, put up with my naked display. And in the meantime, if anybody would like a selfie with their very own, Sunday Papers Live, Lady Godiva, then you can find me in the bar.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm sure there's a few questions in the audience. Please do not